Faith is believing in something you can't see, you can't feel, something that can't be proven.
Then how do you know which is the right faith?
I think that's a gut thing.
I don't think about a right faith. I think about what resonates with me. I feel authentic. It brings me peace.
I think there is no absolute truth in any religion. I think it's a matter of subjective experience.
I kind of just trust my intuition, trust my gut.
You just know. You just gotta follow it.
You just gotta follow what you think is your faith.
If faith is blind, then what makes one belief better or worse than any other? And if it's just a leap in the dark, why should any of us feel obligated to believe anything at all? My name is Shane Rosenthal. I was raised in a Jewish home but became an atheist at a very young age. Later, as I began to question things, I ended up losing faith in my atheism and converted to Christianity. Since that time, I've never stopped asking questions, and I've spoken with authors and scholars from all over the world in order to explore the beliefs and ideas that shape our lives. Over the years, one thing I've concluded is this: we're all believers. But because there are so many conflicting ideas and worldviews out there, we just can't all be right. So how do we find the truth? On this podcast, we'll start by asking questions.
I'm really just trying to figure out what I believe right now.
Hey there, welcome to another episode of the Humble Skeptic Podcast. On the last episode, I spoke with New Testament scholar Daniel Wallace about the historical reliability of the fourth gospel, along with evidence that it should be dated before 70 AD. On this program, I'll be airing an interview I recorded with historian John Dickson about his assessment of the historical value of all four New Testament gospels. Last month, on an episode of his Undeceptions podcast, John Dickson made a surprising announcement related to his view of the dating of the fourth gospel. Though most New Testament scholars, even in conservative circles, place it in the 80s or 90s, Dickson said this.
Most scholars date John to about the 90s AD. That's what I've taught for years at Macquarie University and Sydney University and elsewhere. But the work of a few outlier scholars in recent times has left me nowadays thinking this gospel could be as early as Mark's gospel. So the 60s AD. But that's another conversation.
Though he didn't end up specifying which scholars in particular helped him to reconsider the date of the fourth gospel, John Dickson, like Daniel Wallace, now appears to be open to a date before the Jewish War, sometime in the early 60s. Another important New Testament scholar who has recently changed his view of the date of John's gospel is Princeton scholar James Charlesworth. Here's what he writes. All the reasons that require a late date for the Gospel of John sometime after 90 CE have vanished. There is no longer a consensus regarding the date of John. I'm convinced, he says, that the earliest edition of John may predate 70 CE. Why? It is because the author knew Jerusalem intimately, providing many architectural details which only 30 years ago we imagined were literary inventions. John is not a late composition. End quote. James Charlesworth is not a conservative scholar who has arrived at his conclusion based on certain evangelical presuppositions. He's a moderate to liberal scholar who has become convinced of an earlier date for John based on a reconsideration of both internal and external evidence. And he also claims that he's not alone. Quote, while many scholars during the 20th century agreed that John is late, dependent on the synoptics, and took shape in the last decade of the first century, a consensus has appeared that each of these points is either inaccurate or in need of reconsideration. He then asks whether it's possible to observe a paradigm shift. His answer is a confident yes. Now, apart from issues related to the dating of the Gospels, there are many other considerations involved in assessing their historical value, and this was the focus of my conversation with John Dickson. I've aired a few clips from this interview on a few occasions, so if you've been listening to this podcast from the beginning, some portions may sound familiar. But on this episode, I'd like you to hear the complete conversation. John Dickson is the host of the Undeceptions podcast, and he received a PhD in the field of ancient history, and he's the author of numerous books, including Is Jesus History? In the opening of this particular book, he writes that Christianity is unlike other religions in that it gambles its plausibility on supposed historical events. Christians, he writes, don't merely say otherworldly things like heaven is open to all, but they also say that Christ suffered under Pontius Pilate. And statements of this kind, he says, are not immune from historical scrutiny. When I had the opportunity to talk with him, I first asked why he thought this was an important point to emphasize in our day.
Well, I mean, there are two ways of looking at it. One is that Christians are just stuck with history, whether they like it or not. Every Christian is a historian. Our principal texts, our sacred scriptures, are historical documents, and they make it clear that they are historical documents. So we have historical biographies in the case of the Gospels. We have a kind of history in the book of Acts, and we have actual letters in our epistles section of the New Testament that are very much like Governor Pliny's letters to various friends and to the emperors. So we are stuck with history, the events that we claim at the very heart of our faith, being the life of Jesus, his teaching, his miracles, his death and resurrection. These are all historical events. So from that side, it's important. Regardless of whether a non-Christian asks any questions, Christians are stuck with history and always have been. Then when you introduce our skeptical world, it amps the whole thing up, because people notice when you shift from saying, I believe God loves you, to I believe Jesus died under the fifth governor of Judea. They notice a pivot there. The first one is something they can't test. I mean, they may or may not feel that love, and they may or may not be interested in that love of God, but they certainly can't test it. You can't really critique it. But as soon as you say Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate, we've taken a step into the real world, we might say, and thoughtful friends who don't believe are going to say, how do you know that? And that's where history comes in as a useful discipline for saying, here are some things we can know about the historical dimension of the Christian faith.
Early on, you say that your book is an attempt to explain not only what we know about Jesus, but also how we know those things. Can you go into that a little?
Well, how we know is just the same rules of history that we would apply to Alexander the Great, Emperor Tiberius, Pliny the Younger. And it boils down to a few things. First, you've got to know what the documents are that refer to the event and how independent they are. How many different kinds of documents do you have talking about the event? And once you're fairly confident, you know what's in your primary texts and when they were written by whom, then you read those documents, you read their claims, you read the testimony, and you approach it with an openness to testimony, because that is fundamental to history. Almost everything we know about the ancient past comes to us in the form of testimony, ancient writings. And unless you are open to the testimony of others, you can't even take your first step in ancient history, or modern history for that matter. But the most important thing that classical historians and the best historical Jesus scholars do, the most important thing, is to set our story, the claims of the Gospels and so on, against the background of everything we know about the Roman Empire, about Jewish history at the very time of Jesus, about economics of the time. You try and understand absolutely everything you can about the background, and then you place this story in the foreground and see if it fits. And that is the ultimate method. I mean, there are other methods that historians use. There are all these little tests, but they're just sort of on the margins. The fundamental test of history is, does this narrative fit with everything else we know of that particular time and place? Because if it doesn't fit at that broad level, we worry that we're reading something that was written in another time and place to pretend like it fitted in that time and place. But if it really does fit, then we have a little more confidence in reading the testimony of the Gospels. So historians have to ask a few questions about a document like Luke, or like an author like Luke. One is this figure in a position to know the stuff they report? Secondly, do they have the character of a good witness? That is, can you find them out, exaggerating and bending the truth, or do they have a flowery kind of approach that makes you really nervous that we're not being told the truth? And thirdly, does what they say fit with the general background? I've mentioned that. And fourthly, can you verify any in particular? Are there little details you can absolutely verify? The date of Pontius Pilate, for example. Can that actually be verified? So these are the questions you've got to ask of the text before you do that sort of more minute criteria for the historical Jesus stuff that has become very popular, which I don't completely rule out. I just think it's secondary to this fundamental task. And it seems to me that when you approach the Gospels this way, as testimony that you assess against the background and internally, the Gospels look very good. I mean, in the case of Luke, we can test Luke's trustworthiness with one source in particular. Most scholars agree that Luke has used Mark, the Gospel of Mark, as a source. There are some who perhaps disagree with that, but the vast majority of secular professional scholars think Luke used Mark. Now, that means we can pick up Mark, line it up against Luke's Gospel, and wherever Luke is using Mark, we can check, does he innovate or is he fair? And I think it is crystal clear that Luke is a traditionalist. He's a conservative. There are differences between the exact wording of a Markan story and Luke's rendition of that, but it's so obviously the same story without embellishment. There are differences, but there is not embellishment. The idea that people who were fans of Jesus completely made up stories is one of those sort of old-fashioned ideas that was current in Rudolf Bultmann's days. It's not so common to say that anymore. The stories we have reported, very few people think, even the unique material in Luke, very few people think Luke made anything up and sort of deliberately put in a fake story. Now, the thing is, Luke would never have imagined there would be this whole industry called redaction criticism that tries to work out, how Luke has changed this word in his Markan source, and whole PhDs will be written on the tendencies of Luke to change Mark. But that's, to my mind, that's nuts. I mean, it's nice to know the details. Here are 4 words Luke has in this story that Mark didn't. But when you stand back and read these things like a classical historian would, it is so obvious. Luke is not in the business of speculating or innovating. He's a reliable witness to his Markan source. Now, if we can prove that that is the case in his most substantial source, Mark, it is reasonable, or at least it raises our confidence to think that Luke is pretty good with his other sources as well. And we're pretty sure he had other sources. And I think we can rest pretty confident that in the case of Luke, we're in the hands of a really safe reporter of material who was certainly in a position to know this material, since we can place him in Jerusalem amidst the eyewitnesses in the late 40s AD. Now, if you are in Jerusalem within 15 years of the events, when there are still plenty of eyewitnesses around, you are certainly in a position to know this material.
Do you think that another problem we face today, particularly with the younger generations, is that history itself is viewed with some level of suspicion? The whole idea that since these things happened so long ago, who's to say what really happened?
Yeah, definitely. And this is partly a function of the decline of the study of history in our school systems, because it now seems like a foreign, not even just a foreign country, but maybe another planet. And so you might as well be doing sci-fi as doing ancient history. And that's a pivot in our culture that has had an effect, because, of course, if we wound back 200 years ago, you all had to do history. Even 100 years ago, you all had to do history. And so people 100 years ago, the average sort of educated person 100 years ago, will have had a pretty good idea of Plato's Republic. They probably would have known a little about St. Augustine's view of the self. They certainly will have heard of Aquinas and his arguments for God. And that's just the average educated 20-year-old 100 years ago knew all that. they are completely foreign names now.
Right.
We have stopped doing classical history in our countries to any real degree. And so it seems like, as I say, another planet. And one of the things I try to do in the book is, and I do this in my public lectures as well, is I point out that I wear a denarius, a 2,000-year-old silver coin, and I hand this out to audiences. And I say, look, you are holding something that is indisputably 2,000 years old. You can read the writing on it. You can see the images on the front and back. As you handle this coin, you are actually touching the time of Jesus. This was in the hands of people buying, selling, and being tossed to musicians, being given to miners in the very period in which Jesus lived. And my aim there is to cross that bridge that you mentioned, cross that chasm where people think history is like, it's too ethereal, it's not real. And suddenly when you hold a 2,000-year-old piece of silver with writing and images, you think, oh, these events were once as solid as this silver coin in my fingers.
What do you say to someone who, when you start talking to them about Jesus and this being history, and they say, how can you say this is plausible? The very text that you're talking about with Jesus don't merely have him speaking philosophically or theologically. He's also walking on water and he's raising the dead. How is that plausible?
Well, the first thing to realize is that even leaving aside whether you think miracles are possible, that philosophical question, you can still get to the point where it is crystal clear we have enough early disparate sources to conclude Jesus did things people thought were miracles. Whether I believe in miracles or not is not the point. I mean, even someone like Paula Fredrickson from Boston University, who's not a Christian, doesn't believe miracles are possible, in her chapter on Jesus as healer, nonetheless says she thinks Jesus really did things people thought were miracles. And she's not going to say whether it was psychosomatic or whatever. It's just that we have the evidence from multiple sources quite early in time that paint Jesus as a successful healer. So what a historian does, even one who doesn't believe in miracles, is they say, we don't know what explains it, but Jesus walked around with a reputation as a healer, a successful healer, and that was part of his success. They don't dismiss what they read in the Gospels. They might, they might think a nature miracle pushes things too far, but the general acceptance of Jesus as a healer is very widespread in historical scholarship.
Now, you also say that we're not simply brains suspended in fluid, but that our preferences and experiences play a part as we make decisions about whether something is believable or incredible. And this, you say, has significant implications for how all of us approach evidence.
Of course. So in the ancient world, it was Aristotle who made that distinction that's very famous now between logos, pathos, and ethos. And he said these are the three factors that are influencing whether anyone is persuaded about anything, particularly the things that can't be absolutely proven, like mathematics. So he said, when there's any doubt whatsoever, so as soon as you step outside mathematics, when you hear something and you're trying to work out whether you believe it, there is an intellectual dimension. You try and work out, is it rational? Is there good evidence? That's logos. But Aristotle said it's a fool who thinks that that's how we make decisions in life. Because we're persuaded by pathos and ethos. And pathos is the kind of emotional or aesthetic dimension. Does it resonate with me? And often this is, we're not even conscious of this, but if we like an idea, we're attracted to it, we're more likely to believe it. And thirdly, and Aristotle said this was the most important, the ethos of a thing. And that is, does it have the character, the integrity that is trustworthy? So he said that we rely on people we regard as trustworthy more than people that we regard as untrustworthy. Now, that seems so obvious, but the insight is profound because it means that the information I'm receiving from another person, from someone trying to tell me about something, my history teacher or a science teacher or someone who's written a book on Jesus, my perception of their integrity will determine to a very large degree how I process the information they give. And Aristotle called that ethos, the character dimension of persuasion. And so people who pick up, the Gospels just need to know themselves and realize that there'll be a little bit of intellectual assessment, and that's great. And I do think Christianity can stand up to that kind of intellectual search. But they've also got to be aware of the aesthetic dimension. They may be personally repulsed by something they read in the Gospels. They may not like Jesus' commentary about wealth or what Jesus said on sex. These may just repel me. But we need to be aware that at that point, it isn't the intellectual dimension that is causing me to make a judgment. It's my personal preference or the pathos. But then I think there's the other dimension of, when you read the Gospels, do you find yourself compelled by the integrity of Jesus? Like, does Luke, the reporter, and Jesus, the subject of the report, do they seem trustworthy? And that will be having a massive influence. And added to that, the Christian community I find myself interacting with, this is partly why I do think that the local church is the most effective promoter of the Christian faith, because skeptics get to see the ethos that emerges from this story, the character, and are able to read the story in that context. And I find that people see that as compelling. But while we're just fighting each other on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, there's no ethos. It's all just pathos, and rarely is it even logos.
In a nutshell, you say that faith is not the opposite of knowledge. Trusting human testimony is fundamental both to living in the world and learning about the past. And this trust, like doubt, can be influenced by psychological and social factors just as much as by intellectual considerations.
Yes, and in a psychological frame, Jonathan Haidt from New York University has written that famous book, The Righteous Mind. And I regard it as one of the most important books of the last 10 years. If people haven't read it, they should race out and get it, where he reviews the last 30 years of psychological evidence that a lot more than logos is going on when we assess things. We are brought to our political opinions, our moral opinions, based not only on rationality, but he would say to a large extent on our emotion. So emotion and passion is the elephant, and the rider sitting on top of the elephant trying to move the elephant around is the rationality. Well, Jonathan Haidt is just bringing psychological sophistication to something Aristotle said many years earlier. And in fact, you find in the New Testament as well that a key part of persuasion is ethos.
Yeah. And, Paul even says that we many times suppress the truth in unrighteousness, so that there is that sort of instinctive desire to have things my way.
Yes, indeed. Or on the other side of the ledger, he says, say in Titus 2, that when Christians live out the gospel, he says that you can make the teaching about God our Savior attractive. The Greek word there, kosmeo. You can beautify the message. Well, what does that mean? The message is beautiful on its own. But what he's saying is the life of the believer can beautify the message.
And he also talked about reasoning and persuading with Jews and Greeks in various settings. So it's not just, you have to ask God to zap people. He also works through means.
He really does. And there is a lot more in the New Testament and in early Christian history than most people realize about the use of argumentation and persuasion, not just of an emotional kind, not simply that therapeutic kind, but, hey, this is really true, and God has demonstrated it's true by raising Jesus from the dead. And I have been reminded quite powerfully in researching the 2nd century through to the 5th century of the early church, how nerdy they were. We often have this view that early church was all sort of charismatic and, just all about the Spirit and miracles and so on. And there's good evidence for that. I don't deny it. And they were also incredibly loving and a community of charity like no other in the Roman society. However, what we often overlook is they, to their pagan neighbors, looked like schools. They looked like they were little academic clubs who would gather together, hear a lecture, read a book out loud, and then have discussions about it. And what's more, by the 2nd century, you had to go to school before they would regard you as discipled. You literally had to go to a school. We have evidence from the year 200, reflecting back on the practice of the Church of Rome, that said you had to go to 3 years of once-a-week classes before you were considered a full disciple. Now, of course, you and I might want to say, oh, but you could become a Christian in a second, and they would agree with that. But in order to really understand the faith, you had to do 3 years of once-a-week lessons. And in Jerusalem, there was an alternative which said that you could do 3 hours a day, every day for 7 weeks, and then you could be regarded as a disciple. That's 126 hours of lectures before they thought you understood the Christian faith. I mean, all I'm saying is they were super nerdy, the ancient Christians. They believed in Logos. And when you look at some of the catechetical lectures that we have, and we actually do have a few of them, they interact with pagan philosophy, and they critique, the idea of multiple gods and what is matter. And I just think, man, this is like 3rd century 18-year-old who wants to be a Christian is thrust into a serious philosophical and theological class.
You also talk about the Gospel of John. I mean, the various geographical or even architectural details that he mentions can be verified and have been verified archaeologically. So that gives us reason to trust him in areas that we can't.
Yeah, that's right. Because it's like life, isn't it? If I get to know you and little bits and pieces of what you say turn out to be really accurate, then I'm going to build up a general picture of you as a trustworthy person. And so when you tell me something that I can't verify, I've got the bank of trustworthiness already to draw on, and I'm going to trust you. So there are plenty of things where we don't have information that Luke tells us about. He mentions something, but we have no other way of verifying it. If you've grown to think Luke is a trustworthy witness, you're just going to take him on faith. And I don't mean religious faith. I mean the faith that every historian places in their sources when they've grown to trust the source. It's the same trust that we all had in our high school history teacher, those of us who had high school history teachers, or our science teachers. I mean, virtually everything most of us know about science, we know only by faith.
Go into that a little bit. Help us understand, why does science require faith?
Well, for a lot of reasons. Faith in its sort of original meaning, it really comes down to confidence or trust. That's the root idea of the word. The idea that it's sort of blindly accepting things without evidence is a brand new definition in the history of the world. You can actually date when this started to happen, when people started to use the word faith in the sort of believing things without evidence. It was in the 1800s. Now, how does this relate to all forms of knowledge and science in particular? I have never looked through the microscope at the things biologists tell me are going on in cells. So everything I know about the nature of the cell, I got from my science teacher and from the science textbook. And I accepted it. And I found the same thing reported elsewhere. And so I built up a general confidence. The same is true with questions about the laws of physics. They tell me that gravity has this particular force that can be measured. And I've never gone and tested it myself. But I believe it. Now, why do I believe it? I am simply trusting testimony. There's no way around this. The only people who don't have to trust testimony are the scientists who specialize in that very discipline. So even someone like Richard Dawkins, most famous atheist, but also a very competent zoologist, even Richard Dawkins is relying on his buddies in physics to know about the speed of light. He's never actually gone and tested that. He's relying on the testimony in academic journals or his friends down the road in Oxford. He's relying on their testimony. He judges them to be worthwhile, valuable, trustworthy, and he believes it.
And even if he had tested it himself, he still has to have faith in his own rationality and in the reliability of sense perception. That gets more philosophical, but it makes the point.
Absolutely. I mean, yes, everything becomes about trust. And as you say, even trusting my own faculties.
As I look across the current landscape of popular books and the sort of messages that you're likely to hear on Christian radio or television, at least in this country, more often than not, Christianity is presented as a kind of therapy. In other words, most Christians today seem to focus on their own subjective experience of the faith and have essentially left all those complicated questions about the historical Jesus for liberal college professors to sort out. Is that basically your read of the situation there in Australia?
We don't have the Christian industry that you do in America. I mean, it never ceases to amaze me when I visit the US, as I do often. I'm pressing through the radio channels in my hire car, and I can hardly get away from a Christian channel. I want news radio. I'm looking at news radio. Where's the news? But we don't experience that side of things. But the notion that Christianity is therapeutic, I think, is universal in the Western world. And it's a shining example of how, for better or worse, and often worse, Christians are influenced by the prevailing culture, the prevailing questions, and can shape their gospel in the direction of the prevailing questions of the culture. And so, we live in a therapeutic culture. We live in a culture that's always asking, how can this improve my life in some way? And Christians have gone, oh, we've got an answer to that. And they find some true things and some half-true things and some completely untrue things in our founding documents and say, here's an answer. And we take our eye off the ball. In Australia, I think one of the advantages, if I can call it that, is that we're sort of further down the post-Christian plank than America is.
Interesting.
And so we have had a lot more public skepticism for longer. I've watched what's happened in the US in the last 10 years, last 5 years in particular. And, it's quite dramatic, the speed at which America seems to be secularizing. But Australia's sort of been there for 20 years. And so what that means is I think, I hope this is not my imagination, but I think Christians are a little bit more attuned, not just to the therapeutic questions, which are universal in Western culture, but to the specifically skeptical questions. When people who aren't Christians look at the Christian faith and they hear us say, oh yeah, we've got an answer to that therapeutic question and that therapeutic question, but then they can see, okay, maybe Christianity can be framed as helpful, but is it true? And suddenly the skeptic throws us back to, is this a real thing you're talking about? And in the case of Christianity, which is quite unlike, say, Buddhism or Hinduism or even Islam, in the case of Christianity, that takes you straight back to history, to a particular time and place. We don't believe in a scripture that sort of fell out of heaven, that is just the divine dictation of things God said in the heavens. We believe in, actual events that have been reported by a multiplicity of witnesses. So we're once again stuck with history. It's interesting that people, used to say 20 years ago in sort of apologetics circles that historical questions have gone away and, we're now postmodern, and we all went, oh, okay, yeah. But I find time and time again that people who present with postmodern questions, therapeutic questions, aesthetic questions, if they find enough answers, will suddenly pivot to, but how do you know? They suddenly become modernists again.
Yeah.
Which is just a way of saying people have more questions now. They have the grab bag of modernist questions as well as the postmodern questions.
Talk to our listeners for a moment about the importance of Paul's writings and how they can be used as evidence for the historical Jesus.
Well, some scholars think they are the most important witnesses to Jesus because they are so early. Paul, of course, is writing his letters in the 50s. So here we have a whole collection of letters from a figure writing in the 50s to communities that have existed for 5 to 10 years before him, who are all obviously aware of the events for the 20 years prior. Now, that's fascinating, especially as Paul's not the least bit interested in laying down the story of Jesus to his audience.
Yeah, he's assuming they know certain things about him.
These are letters to people who knew it all.
Yeah.
We know they knew it all because Paul, in passing, mentions all sorts of things and will often say, let me remind you, or as I said when I was with you. And if you count up all the things Paul mentions to these churches that he founded years before, all the things he mentions that he's already told them, you end up with a pretty large list of stuff they knew about Jesus, the historical Jesus, including, just simple things like his name, that he was a Jew, born of a Jewish woman, that he was from the family line of David, that he had 12 disciples who were called the 12, and Peter and John are described as pillars by Paul. Well, that corresponds exactly with what we have in the Gospels, where there is a smaller unit, smaller than the 12, who were very close to Jesus and included Peter and John. The name of Jesus' brother, James, is mentioned. A word or two about divorce, about love of enemy. All these things Paul mentions from Jesus, even a little reference to the missionaries Jesus sent out who ought to be supported financially. That comes from Luke 10. And we could go on. I mean, it's a huge area of study.
Yeah.
What did Paul know about the historical Jesus? And people have, in the past argued, because he says so little about it, he didn't know about a historical Jesus. That's just so, it's historically tone deaf, if I may put it politely, because it's the very fact that he just throws away these things that he knows
Yeah.
That makes this so important as evidence, as the tip of the iceberg for what disciples had to know about the historical Jesus.
Right.
I mean, to my mind, the most important example of all of these is Paul's actual quotation of the Last Supper tradition,
right,
that we find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Paul cites it back to the Corinthians, not as teaching them in that moment, but as reminding them of what he himself received and what he had passed on to them, and then gives an actual quotation of Jesus, which is proof positive that disciples in being converted, even in faraway Corinth, had to learn statements of Jesus and had to know that he said, on the night he was betrayed, he took bread and he said, "This is my body." And even pagan disciples had to know that. And then you turn over a few pages and there's that most famous creedal summary in 1 Corinthians 15.
Yeah, we've talked about this one quite a bit on this program.
It's the earliest of all the summaries of the Christian faith.
Yeah.
And Paul makes clear that he received it from others and passed it on to the Corinthians. And it says that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised to life on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. And that's the end of the creed. But it's a clear 4-line summary of the Passion narrative.
Yeah.
It's the Christos, the Messiah, died, and it was in accordance with the Scriptures, and it was for sins, which takes us right to what all the Gospels say about that death as being for sins. Yeah. He was buried, and the words he uses there, kai hoti etaphe, must mean a proper burial. That cannot refer to being thrown on a rubbish dump. The etaphe word is a giveaway. And then he was raised, and then he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. Well, actually, the Gospels also have an appearance to Peter and appearance to the lot of them. So there's a genuine historical memory here. And this is actually a topic of my academic research at the moment, the use of these early creeds in Christianity. It corresponds very closely to the pattern of teaching that we find in philosophical schools at the same time, even in a place like Corinth, where disciples of, say, the Epicurean philosophy had to learn not just actual sayings of Epicurus, but mnemonic summaries of Epicurus's teaching. And we have a 4-line summary of Epicurus's teaching called the Tetrapharmakos, which is almost identical in length to this little creed in 1 Corinthians 15, and is just a bullet point summary of what Epicurus taught. And the cool thing about it is we not only have this 4-line thing, we have a 4-paragraph summary of those same points, and we have a 40-paragraph account of Epicurus's teaching. So we have the full-blown thing, which is about the length of the Sermon on the Mount. We have a 4-paragraph summary, which is 200 words. And then we have a 4-line summary of about 35, 40 words. And disciples had to be drilled, Epicurean disciples had to be drilled on this. Now, this is in exactly the same time Paul is going to Corinth and telling them, you've got to learn big stories, and you've got to be able to quote, on the night he was betrayed, Jesus took bread, etc. And you've got to be able to contract it into little mnemonics that are signs of the larger material, like that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, etc. So I think what we have here in this material is pretty good evidence that already in Paul's day, and probably in the decade before, so I'd be confident saying from the 40s, we have a school classroom-like approach to learning the Jesus story amongst the first disciples, even the pagans. We already knew the Jews did that. So we should already expect that kind of rabbinic or at least Pharisaic drilling of oral material. But it is crystal clear that pagans did the same thing.
And this isn't a disputed fact even in radically liberal scholarship, right? I mean, the idea that 1 Corinthians 15 represents a creed that Paul himself had received. Talk about that for a moment, and how early some of these liberals think that this creed goes back to.
Yeah, even beyond liberal, even sort of atheistic and agnostic scholars like Gerd Ludemann, Robert Funk will say that this goes back to within a few years of the events, because the technical language that Paul uses there is the same language we know philosophers used for passing on philosophical material, and the same language Josephus uses of what Pharisees did with their oral traditions. That is, pass on and receive. Paradidomai, paralambano. And this is the language Paul uses for he received, he passed on. Now, we know when Paul received his material. We know when he was converted. And so he either got this material, sort of instantly upon his conversion, which would take us to maybe 31, 32 in Damascus, or you could say he got it when, according to his own testimony, he was in Jerusalem with Peter and James. So that's the year 33, 34. So take your pick. I'm happy saying within about 3 or 4 years of the events themselves, Paul received this creedal tradition. The fact that it mentions Cephas, that Peter is actually named in it, I think tips me over the edge to think that he got it from Peter.
For the last 150 or 200 years, you've had so many scholars arguing that this story evolves over time. But what you're saying here is we have a creedal statement dating to the mid-30s, which shows Christians believed he was the Messiah, he was dead and buried and risen, and all this fulfilled the Old Testament scriptures.
Yeah, and the fact that it's a creed tells you that the narrative was much earlier.
Right.
Because in order for something to be put into a creed, it has to be a deliberate summary of larger blocks of material. That is the nature of a creed. It's the nature of how the Epicurean stuff worked that I mentioned a moment ago. They didn't start with the 4-line tetrapharmakos and then over the years added another 4 paragraphs and then the 40 paragraphs. No, the 40 paragraphs were first. They were the actual sayings of Epicurus that disciples had to learn. And then they were summarized into these tiny creeds for mnemonic effect. So when you look at that creed, it says, Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. That's the summary line that you're meant to know. Now, the thing is, what's it a summary of? It is clearly a summary of his messianic status. It's Christ who died. It's clearly a mnemonic summary of some kind of death account, right? He died. So they must have known how he died and some sort of conditions around that. It's already theologically interpreted. It's on behalf of sins using sacrificial Jewish language, probably out of Isaiah 53. There's a bit of research into that. And what's more, it's katatas graphas. It's in accordance with the Old Testament scriptures, which means disciples who learnt that one line had to know scriptures that pointed to an atoning death on behalf of others.
Right.
The way these creeds worked is that because they were summaries of larger blocks of material, they were important tools for teachers to be able to say which scriptures. And as disciples meant to know that. And that's just the first line. And then when you go kai hoti etafe, that he was buried, gets its own line, I think makes perfectly clear they knew a narrative about the burial. And our burial narratives are between 80 and 100 words long. That's what we have in the Gospels. That's easily memorizable. We only have kai hoti etafe in that creed.
Yeah.
But those 3 words clearly summarize a narrative block. Just these deceptively simple, small statement in 1 Corinthians 15 is full of interest to the historian because of what it tells us about the didactic educational model of early Christianity. An 18-year-old pagan Corinthian had to learn not only this whole narrative about Jesus, they had to learn a book that was entirely foreign to them called the Scriptures, called the Jewish Scriptures. And what an educational world that opened up to just your average 18-year-old tanner from down the road in Corinth, who's now a Christian, they have to be able to know which passages of the Old Testament pointed to these events. And what's more, not just in a proof texty way, they had to have some sort of substantial knowledge of what a Messiah was. Because that's nonsensical, it's certainly not clear to a pagan living in Corinth. They had to know the background of the anointed ones. And according to the scriptures that follows the raised on the third day, according to the scriptures in that little creedal statement, must refer to all of the promises of the eternal Son of David.
Right.
And in particular, Psalms about God not letting
the Holy One see corruption. Yeah.
Yeah. And the reason we know it must refer to that is because we have in the preaching of Acts and elsewhere, these are the passages that preachers like Paul and Peter used. So they must be the passages that are referred to in this little creed. So these pagans in Corinth had a giant task, and they just had to put up with it. This is, to be a Christian, you got to know all this stuff. You got to know the story and the backstory.
Yeah. So you have to know what you believe, which is the theological content, and also why you believe it. This was fulfilled in our day, seen by eyewitnesses. Otherwise, Paul says, as he continues in that text from 1 Corinthians 15, if this didn't really happen, then we're all of men most to be pitied.
Yeah. And they probably knew the names of the 12 as well. It makes no sense for this creed to say he appeared to Peter, or Cephas, and then the 12. I mean, who are the 12? Never heard of the 12? Well, they must have known who the 12 were. I mean, after the creed, Paul mentions James as well. So they obviously had to know who James was, James, the brother of Jesus. So the amount of information the early Christians had, I think, is underestimated by skeptical folks, but I think well appreciated by those who have a more historical sensibility.
You've been talking about the kind of knowledge the young catechumen there in Corinth would need to know. But what does that say about us? Do you think we, modern Christians around the world, are we prepared to know what we believe and why we believe it? Do we have adequate knowledge of our Old Testament texts, or are we just kind of living in a happy therapeutic kind of thing?
I mean, I can answer it by saying I feel often rebuked by what was expected of the first Christians in terms of their knowledge and so on. And yes, what was also demanded was a living faith, a willingness to suffer for Christ, a call to care for the poor, a call to promote the gospel however you can, all these things that we recognize. But I do think in some Christian traditions today, we have lost the far more serious intellectual exercise involved in being a Christian. And that is learning back to front the core of the faith, which is what's in the Gospels, and learning the backstory to that, which is our Old Testament scriptures, and seeing how Christ is the fulfillment of that, and doing it as basic discipleship. So not rushing into, 5 tips for sharing your faith or 5 tips on tithing, sort of practical stuff. No, it really seems that what the New Testament demanded of disciples, and let's just pause to recognize that the word disciple simply means student. It is the word for a student. What was demanded of disciples was a pretty thorough knowledge of the Old Testament plot, of some Old Testament details, particularly those around David and their fulfillment in Jesus Christ, the memorizing of gospel material, as well as all those other more practical things. And when I read some of the early Christian sort of preached material that we have, whether it's in the Apostolic Fathers toward the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century, I do feel really quite rebuked. The subtlety of their allusions to Old Testament passages, the stuff that disciples listening were expected to know, not just about Jesus, but about the Old Testament, leaves me thinking, wow, have I, who've spent a lot of time also as a teacher in a church, have I made that expectation of my congregations? And have I helped them through my preaching know with subtlety, not just the therapeutic nature of the gospel, but have I helped them understand the Old Testament as it's fulfilled in Christ? I keep coming back to the fact that Paul expected a 17-year-old in Corinth to do this hard work of memorization of Jesus' material, of understanding the Old Testament. And are we not capable of rising to the level of a first century 17-year-old pagan? Have we dropped the bar so low that we can't even reach to that standard? It seems to me deeply troubling. And I think one of the reasons that the early church, was so big on catechesis, like hours of learning of this material, was they knew that only a depth of knowledge of the truth of Christ, as it's found in the Old Testament and the New Testament, will sustain Christians through persecution. You might win people with the candy, in happy times, but if you want Christians to maintain the faith amidst very serious pressure, which the early Christians faced, it's only a depth of knowledge that is the grounding that can hold you firm in those times. I think that's partly what was behind their insistence on depth of learning.
Folks, you've been hearing from John Dickson, who is the host of the Undeceptions podcast and author of Is Jesus History, along with numerous other helpful books that I'll link to in the show notes. By the way, I recently wrote an article about a relatively obscure disciple named Joanna, whose existence, I argue, has now been confirmed by a fascinating archaeological artifact. In fact, this discovery may shed light not only on the identity of Joanna, but also on Luke's patron, Theophilus. In my view, this evidence provides just one more indication that the Gospels are describing real historical events and real historical individuals. You can find a link to this article in the show notes for this episode, and if you find this show helpful, while you're there, consider upgrading to a paid subscription or making a one-time donation to help support the Humble Skeptic podcast. The address is humbleskeptic.com, that's humbleskeptic.com, and I look forward to being with you again next time as we discuss the beliefs and ideas that shape our lives.